Our vice president was supposed to introduce the next speaker, but instead you get your editor. My name's Diane DeBlois, and shameless plug for the journal. Always we welcome proposals for articles or suggestions of who I might contact for articles. We like to get a good mix. The next speaker has been a very loyal contributor, not just to this journal, but to virtually all the journals that I subscribe to. Art Groten is a major writer on ephemera, both in our world and in the world of postal history, where he has been an unabashed ambassador for the embrace of ephemera by all philatelists. We like to remind stamp collectors that stamps are ephemera. And he has served as president of the society, has been on the board, and he probably came to this topic that he's going to do through airmail, because airmail pilots were some of the early racers against time and gravity, and many of them had spectacular crashes. But then he became very interested in the whole idea of those early barnstormers and the early aviation racers. So welcome, Art Groten.
Hi. You will be happy to know that my talk is only a half hour. And we can truncate the questions, because don't ask me anything technical. Don't ask me anything technical, because the answer is, I don't know. But I will refer you to a good reference to do that. All right, so before I start, a little quiz, okay? Everybody raise their hand if you know who Professor Samuel P. Langley is. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Next, who knows who Glenn H. Curtis is? Okay. Next, who knows who the Wright brothers are? Okay. Now, virtually everyone who is asked who is the most important person in early aviation. Okay, hands up. Langley? Curtis? Wright brothers? Okay, good, that sets the stage, because this is a bait and switch. Come on. This one? That's wrong. Got it. We are going to talk about Glenn Curtis, because when I started organizing the material for my initial talk, I realized that it was virtually impossible to trace the history of competitive flying in the United States, actually in Europe, and then came to the United States. Not possible. So I said that, okay, I'll just do the US. Not possible in a short period of time. So I decided to pick one pioneer. And I would say Glenn Curtis is the single most important person in the development of aviation as we know it. And after reviewing much of the literature, that's my belief. And others would argue Langley, but we'll talk about that later. Granted, the Wright brothers' success at Kitty Hawk on December 17, 1903, in making the first heavier-than-air flight, albeit only a few feet, was remarkable. However, that success did not come from whole cloth. As early as 1891, I'm supposed to hit a slide here. Wrong one. Okay, now I got it. Okay, that's right. That's right. That's Curtis, Glenn Curtis. It says so. Okay, good. There we go. Now, as early as 1891, Professor Samuel P. Curtis, Langley, later Secretary of the Smithsonian, was experimenting with aerodynamics. And even earlier, serious study had been made for all forms of flight for over 100 years if you don't go back to Da Vinci. And with the encouragement of another pioneer, Octave Chanute, by 1896, Langley was ready to do some serious testing of the principles he'd been studying for so long. August 1903, he tested a scale model of a plane that flew 1,000 feet at the Potomac River near Washington. He prepared for a test of a full-size plane on October 7th, and it failed. He tried again on December 8th. It failed. He had neglected to take into account the fact that there is not a linear distribution between weight and power. His engines were underpowered. That's why it didn't work. Okay. His plane later went to the Smithsonian. Well, after that test, it went to the Smithsonian. The Wright plane was equipped with wing warping device manipulated by the pilot's shoulders. And if you've ever been to the cradle of Aviation Museum in Long Island, I suppose it's at the National Air and Space, you can actually get into this thing and lay down there, and you can see, by moving the shoulders, you warp the wings. And so they patented that invention, and it became the central exhibit for their attempt through patent lawsuits to maintain a monopoly on the construction of flying machines. Their particular nemesis was Curtiss, who had a natural affinity for things mechanical. He replaced the wing warping mechanism with what would later be called ailerons. Now, the French had been working on them since 1909. He started this in 1910, unbeknownst to him that the French were doing it. The Wrights saw that as an infringement and began decades of court battles, which Curtiss eventually won. Had the Wrights spent less time suing and more time designing, they could well have maintained an important place in the continuing development of flying. But they left the vast majority of innovation to Curtiss. God, I hate this. I hit something, didn't I? Yeah, okay, good. I don't care about the rest of it. Wrong way. Okay, now, during the early days of the lawsuit, and to take some of the wind out of Wright's sails, Curtiss obtained permission from the Smithsonian to restore Langley's plane to prove it could fly. He did that on June 2nd, 1914. It seems that Langley's conception was correct, but as noted, his engine was woefully underpowered. With a more powerful engine, Curtiss succeeded in flying the plane. So now we have a conundrum, okay? A plane that could fly in 1896 had it more power, and one that did fly in 1903. After much debate, the Smithsonian exhibited Langley's plane with a plaque that reads, "The first man-carrying airplane in the history of the world capable of sustained free flight." This is Langley. In a fit of pique in 1925, Orville Wright donated his fully restored plane to the Science Museum in London. It returned to the United States after World War II and is now in the Air and Space Museum. While this is not specifically about Wright or their enmity of Curtiss, it seemed appropriate to place Curtiss within the context of what had gone before, and you'll see why. Curtiss was intimately involved early on with the latest innovations, and he saw that the future, there would be both practical and remunerative value to flying. The key to understanding Curtiss and his motivations was his passion for speed. It's what drove his incredibly inventive mind through test after test of new ideas and models. This quest focused his genius, the quest for speed. His schooling ended at 8th grade, so his ideas came from hands-on physical alteration of his models, not for sophisticated engineering plans. As a matter of fact, sophisticated engineering plans didn't really come up until World War I. He used the entertainment value of the aviation craze to push boundaries. At the air meets where he or others of his team competed, his innovations never failed to give spectators their money's worth, while proving to him the progression of his thirst for speed. Like many of his contemporaries who became enamored of the automobile and the airplane, he began life as the classic Yankee tinkerer, first with bicycles, then with motorcycles. On his motorcycles, he's moved from two-engine to two-cylinder to four-cylinder to eight-cylinder motors. And in January 1907, on this motorcycle, V8, he set the world record for land speed. This is 1907, of 136.1 miles an hour at Ormond Beach in Florida. And that record stood for years. As noted, speed was the siren that called him. Most of the prizes he won were for speed rather than altitude and endurance, although he did win some for the latter. What follows is a heavily edited discussion of the awards he won. A full account would require a book, and in fact, several have been written. In the context of this talk, we should remember that his primary goal was continued advancement of flying. But he clearly understood the entertainment value, and as he improved each model, he would demonstrate it publicly at one venue or another. This attracted not only public interest, but also financial backing. His first significant prize was a gold medal for the best motor at the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition. It was for a motorcycle engine. On the strength of this and his speed records, backers came forth, and on October 19, 1905, the G.H. Curtis Manufacturing Company, Inc. was formed. Left-handed, I'll try to remember to do the left one. He had no interest in aviation, but he was approached by balloonist Thomas S. Baldwin for a Curtis 8-cylinder motor to power his dirigible experiments. Oh, for crying out loud. Cut it out. No, why isn't it doing that? That's it? That's it? All right, Curtis and Baldwin. Right, there we go. So he's got this motor on here. And on June 28, 1907, Curtis flew in a balloon for the first time and was hooked on the pursuit of speed in the air. And during the following months, he worked with Baldwin to create a demonstration vehicle for the Army using his own engine. Okay. He turned to heavier air than air machines, and within a year had produced two prototypes, the Red Wing and the White Wing, so named for their wing colors. The White Wing was the first to use ailerons and to take off using wheels rather than skids. They were successful, both planes. So he decided to try for the newly offered Scientific American Trophy for the first person in the U.S. to make a public flight of over 1 kilometer. For this, he designed and constructed the June Bug. On July 4th, 1908, he flew 1,550 meters at Reims, a small wine depot near Hammondsport, his hometown, and the site of his manufacturing plant. It was the first of his 3 consecutive Scientific American trophies. No new prizes were offered until mid-1909. We'll talk about that in a minute. Thereafter, they became a necessity at all major aviation events to attract paying customers. In the meanwhile, Curtis, using the June Bug as a starting point, began his earliest work on what was to be his greatest legacy, the aero hydroplane, later the hydroplane, and finally the flying boat. He did this by adding pontoons to the June Bug and renaming her the Loon. Hopefully this is going to work. Ta-da! So there's the June Bug, and he just stuck some pontoons on it, and it worked. Okay. During this time, he designed a completely new style of plane, much more controllable due to the use of larger, true ailerons and a 4-cylinder water-cooled engine. He called her the Gold Bug. The Gold Bug. She debuted in May 1909 and was immediately sold to the Aeronautical Society for America for $5,000, making it the first commercial sale in the U.S. Renamed the Golden Flyer, he entered her in the first major international competition in Reims, France. First, however, on July 17th at Morris Park, New York, Curtiss won his second Scientific American trophy for the longest flight of the year, 24.7 miles, this time in the Golden Flyer. From there, it was off to France and the first international air race, Grand Aviation Week of Champagne, August 22nd to the 29th, 1909 at Reims. And this is the catalog. Okay, there's the trophy. The major prize of this concours was the first Gordon Bennett Cup. Now, Gordon Bennett had done previous cup for balloon flying, but this was the first for heavier than air. And it was 25,000 French francs and this trophy. And James Gordon Bennett was the publisher of the New York Herald. For this event, Curtiss increased the power of the Golden Flyer with an 8-cylinder engine. That's basically, this thing hits the thing and it does it. Why does it do that? Where was I? Anyway, that's basically the Golden Flyer, just a little bit bigger. And he increased the power, used larger ailerons to increase the banking speed and stability. And he won the prize at 46.7 miles an hour, just ahead of Louis Blériot. And because that was very important, when you went around the pylons, Blériot, because his plane didn't have ailerons, had to sort of, to avoid skidding, had to go way around the pylon. Whereas Curtiss, because he could bank his plane, was much tighter into the curve, and that saved him the time and enabled him to win. From there, he immediately went to the first Italian meet at Brescia, September 8th to 20th, the first such meet outside France. There had been several others in France. Where on the 11th, he won 50,000 lira grand prize for speed at 37.8 miles an hour, not nearly as fast as Reims. So this is sort of like Lindbergh flying the Atlantic, right? I mean, this guy goes to France and wins the first Gordon Bennett Cup. So this is big news. So great was the interest in his winning that John Wanamaker, owner of major stores in New York and Philly, contracted to put the plane on display in his stores for 6 weeks upon her return home. This is a clear indication that at least one savvy businessman saw the entertainment value of flying, as thousands of people flocked to his stores to see this famous plane that beat them all in Europe. So it's sort of interesting. If you look up at the top left, this guy picked it up off the floor, of the Curtiss workshops. Okay, now let's see. The next major exhibit was at Dominguez Field in Los Angeles, January 10th to 20th in 1910, and it was the first held in the U.S. Curtiss, in the Golden Flyer, set the then world speed record over a mile at 43.9 miles an hour. That's over a mile as opposed to over a course that might have been longer or shorter. The poster stamp in the show was extremely rare, as are the promotional postcards. That thing is a folder, and it opens up, and there are 10 different illustrations of the great flyers of that time, most of them being French. This real photo postcard of Curtiss in flight, dated January 31st, used after that meet, although from that meet, carries the message, quote, "This picture is Glenn Curtiss in his world record flight for a mile and is a good picture," end quote. Remember that in those early days, these various records were being broken on an almost weekly basis. Curtiss's next challenge was announced at the Hudson Fulton celebration of 1909, when Joseph Pulitzer, owner of the New York World, offered $10,000 to the aviator who could retrace Columbus's voyage up or down the Hudson by plane. Okay. This fantastical postcard gives the details, and I enlarged them if you can see that on the right side. To promote the celebration, this postage stamp was issued, the second such stamp, aviation stamp in the States. First, it appeared without a hyphen. I was supposed to bring my pointer, but I didn't. The first one between Hudson and Fulton, no hyphen. Then there's a hyphen. The people who like printing will see that on the F of Fulton here, there's a blob. And that was a piece of schmutz that got onto the plate. And because here's a mint there, very scarce, but it shows you clearly from one to the other that thing is moving. Here's another one on the cover. Okay, so next slide. No one was able to make the trip in 1909. The prize remained unclaimed. May of 29th, 1910, Curtis successfully completed the journey, 150 miles in 2 hours, 51 minutes at the rate of 52 miles an hour with 2 stops for fuel. The first stop was on a field belonging to F.W. Gill about 2 miles south of the Poughkeepsie Railroad Bridge, currently the home of a massive IBM facility. The second was at Inwood in the northern Bronx at the home of William Isham, now the site of Isham Park. He did so in an as yet unnamed plane with a newly designed, more powerful engine to which he added pontoons in case of a water landing. We should note that this was the first attempt to prepare for a water landing at a public event. This is a development that looms large in the latest story of Curtis's career. In doing this, he not only won the world's $10,000 prize, but also became permanent holder of the Scientific American Trophy for distance. Okay. The message on this postcard, dated May 31st, I remember he did this on May 29th, reads, arrived at GC, Grand Central Terminal, at 8:39, and realized we'd been in the, quote, country, end quote, when I learned that Curtis had made a successful flight from Albany nearly 48 hours previously. The general public followed these record flights with great interest, and so a special train on the eastern shore of the Hudson, packed with family, colleagues, the press, tracked his progress. On June 11th, just not even 2 weeks later, Scientific American had a front page photo of Curtis over the Hudson River. And a day later, the World issued a postcard showing Curtis landing at Governor's Island with a facsimile signature. Did it hit it? Cut it out. I don't know which way to go. Wrong way. No, that's right. Yeah. In any event, this piece of ephemera is about 9 by 12 inches, and it is an enlargement of the small postcard that I was talking about. But I use a large one because it shows it better. That was part of a supplement that was put out by the World. In any event, he named this plane the Hudson Flyer. On June 12th, at the Atlantic City Air Carnival, quote, Curtis won the $5,000 prize for the fastest, as mentioned in this postcard. Actually, the prize was for duration over water, 50 miles in an hour and 14 minutes. For the postal historian, note that the card was forwarded from Paris to Vienna. his planes at this time were the best ones designed for speed. Next, he traveled to Cleveland, where he again won $5,000. Now remember, he sold his plane for $5,000. I mean, $5,000 is a lot of money. For the longest flight over water, now it was 64.75 miles from Euclid Beach to Cedar Point on August 31st. The text message notes, "This is G. Curtis doing an exhibition flight after having come from Cleveland to CP. I was there. It was very interesting." End quote. In anticipation of becoming a father, Curtis's last personal competitive exhibition appearance was at the Harvard Boston Aero Meet, September 3rd to 13th, 1910. The program lists Curtis as Aviator 3. Further on is a photo of him in his Curtis plane at the meet. The rest is a roster of who's who of the racing era at that time: Brookins, Johnstone, Graham White, and Hamilton, among others. His only prize, however, was $2,000 second place for speed. He played no significant role in the next major air meet at Belmont Park, New York, October 23rd to 31st, 1910. He had thought to defend his Gordon Bennett trophy, but decided against it primarily because of the lawsuit that he was undergoing with the rights, but he said for technical reasons. In any event, he and Charles Hamilton, on the left in that postcard, who had won the New York to Philadelphia Challenge earlier in the year, were both pictured on a promotional postcard in anticipation of Curtis's competing. There was certainly a draw value to his name, and I suspect that there were some disappointments. But Hamilton was an amazing aviator, and the crowds got their money's worth. Ephemera for this meet is particularly scarce, and I can show the entry tickets from the field at $1 and the grandstand at $2. Retirement from competitive flying, however, did not mean the end of his involvement in the development of aviation. Indeed, it gave him more time to pursue his particular interest in hydroplanes with a view to their military use. Top. His scow pontoon hydroplane's first successful flight was on January 26, 1911. It is basically an open biplane with a pontoon. It was reported in March 4th, 1911 issue of Scientific American. At top. Just after that first flight, a postcard from San Diego dated February 7th, 1911 mentions, "Mr. Curtis had his monoplane out today, and he has a bag under it, and it went in the water." It is not clear if it was truly a monohydroplane that the writer was referring to, because no such plane yet existed. Curtis actually, his first monoplane was 1915, but most of his planes, well into the 20s, were biplanes. These sorts of air-sea demonstrations were making Curtis a household word and presaged his interest in advanced hydroplanes and flying boats. His next step was to prove to the Navy that a plane could successfully make a ship-to-shore flight. So, on November 12th, 1910, and this is just, 3 years after he started, Eugene Ely did so from the deck of the cruiser Birmingham in Hampton Roads in Virginia. He also piloted, now this is even more astounding, he also piloted the first shore-to-ship flight on January 18th, 1911 from the Presidio in San Francisco to the deck of the cruiser Pennsylvania, and that's a picture here. So important was this achievement that it was featured on the front cover of a French weekly, Le Pèlerin. The fundamentals of the apparatus that Curtis developed to stop the plane once it landed on board are still used today. For these reasons, Curtis has been called the father of naval aviation. In 1911, for all these innovations, he won the first Robert J. Collier Trophy, sponsored by the president of the Collier Publishing Group. It was to be given annually to the greatest achievement in aeronautics or astronautics in America with respect to improving the performance, efficiency, and safety of air and space vehicles, the value of which has been thoroughly demonstrated, during the preceding year. Curtis was the first recipient for his development of the pontoon hydroplane. He had devoted much of 1909 and 1910 to this project. In giving the first award to Curtis, the announcement said, "No event since the advent of the airplane itself has aroused so much interest as the aerohydroplane." He again won the Collier Trophy in 1912 for inventing the single pontoon seaplane and the development of the flying boat. While Curtis was keeping busy with his experiments on water, his pilots continued to fly competitively. He had a group of pilots who would go around flying his planes in demonstrations. The Chicago International meet at Grant Park was sponsored by the Aero Club of Illinois, ACI, from August 21st to the 20th, 1911. The grandstand ticket specifies how to get in, costs $1. The box seats were $2. Each day, the results were announced and published in a small leaflet by Marshall Field and Company, one of Chicago's premier retailers. Down at the right. The Chicago meet was the largest yet held in the U.S. and generated a lot of interesting souvenir material. A special medal was given to each aviator, the first thing on the left, which could also be purchased by the public. And the officials had their own ACI medals and pins. This advertising cover, dated July 5th, 1911, used by the committee to promote the meet, is the only one of its type recorded. The semiotics of the image is fascinating. The woman has Mercury's wings on her head and breastplates made of propellers. The same image appears on a rare postage stamp there shown on the envelope used by the ACI. By this time, the notion of female aviators was accepted in this country thanks to the pioneering work of Harriet Quimby and Matilda Moisant. Quimby was, I could go into a whole story. Now, Harriet Quimby is the most famous aviator you've never heard of. Amelia Earhart, in her memoirs, said that without Harriet Quimby, I wouldn't be here. A diversion. Harriet Quimby was the first woman to receive a pilot's license in the United States, number 37, on August 1st, 1911. She was the first woman to fly across the English Channel on April 16th, 1912. The American Examiner, on the left, dedicates a full page to this rather extraordinary event. She was given a special medal, on the right, on her arrival. It's unique. Her friend Matilda was the second woman to receive a pilot's license. Both flew with the Moisant International Aviators in demonstration flights throughout the U.S., Cuba, and Mexico. But their story is worthy of its own talk. And I've written quite a bit about Harriet, actually. Everybody loved Harriet. Curtis continued using the various air meets to promote aviation and his planes with other pilots in the controls, the so-called Curtis flying team. His biplanes and hydro airplanes were featured at the Chicago meet. Hugh A. Robinson, as number 26, listed on the right over there, flew the Curtis hydro airplane. The text on the August 19th postcard reads, "This machine sails on both air and water, can go from water into air and vice versa." A contemporary newspaper notes that a number of other Curtis planes were present as well, flown by Lincoln Beechey, Paul W. Beck, Eugene Eli, John J. Frisbee, Oscar A. Brindley, Philip O. Parmalee, and James Ward, another who's who. The last important meet of 1911 was the Boston-Harvard era meet held August 26th to September 4th. And despite Curtis's photo being included in the program, he is not listed among the participating aviators. Again, his team acted as surrogates. Such was the drawing power of his name. A souvenir of the meet depicts, on the right, depicts Lincoln Beechey racing an automobile in a Curtiss plane. He won, by the way. These things were quite popular all over the country. You have planes racing cars. Curtis's early flying career, especially his Hudson River flight of 1910, made him well known throughout the aviation world and the public at large. His innumerable innovations and his constant quest for better performance and safety were essential to the future of aviation. Of the many fatal crashes that occurred during this early period, not a single one was in a Curtiss plane. 95% of military aviators were trained in his Jenny. His particular interest in hydroplanes, as I said, has made him father of naval aviation. He had always viewed aviation as an economically viable enterprise, and he meant to capitalize on his fame. He became the largest manufacturer of American planes well into the 1930s. This advertisement from Life, dated September 9th, 1912, shows that he wasted no time. This brief overview, I hope, has piqued your interest in early aviation. I could give several more talks on Curtiss alone. In the exhibit hall, I have put up a display outlining in a general fashion the early years, both in Europe and the US, on competitive flying. So I haven't completely abandoned that idea. So go take a look, and I hope you enjoy it. Yeah, I'll take questions as long as they're not technical. Yeah. He made two stops. Correct. That's correct. Well, yes, it was not planned, but he had it laid out. He knew it was there in case he needed it. It was just not quite, he wasn't sure he had quite enough fuel to get to Governor's Island, so he stopped. He didn't want, that wasn't good enough. Yeah, that's where the ceremonies were. And he had to have reconnoitered because he wouldn't have landed there unless he knew it. Isham. Yeah. I think I remember reading that it was, I don't know if it was oil, I think it was fuel, and there wasn't any there, and they had to wait. That's why there was a little delay to get fuel. But in any event, yeah, that was, he thought he could get away with it, but he didn't. No. Well, he would have known that it was possible, I suspect. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other victims? Well, I hope you had a good day, and I encourage you to look at the exhibits, and let's have some fun tomorrow. Thank you.